Welcome back to another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp, where my job is to help train Sabbath School teachers and front row students to get the most out of their class. Today, we are going to be looking at lesson number 10 of the Adult Bible Study Guide. It is entitled Mission to the Unreached, I guess, part 1. So, grab your Bibles and your study guide, because Sabbath School Boot Camp starts now. All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at Paul's sermon to the Areopagus in Athens. There is so much that is worth thinking about and studying here that I wish I could talk about it for 2 weeks, but I'll give you my best shot at the highlights. So, let's go. On Sunday, we're talking about Paul in Athens, which is my favorite sermon in the book of Acts. The first thing is that Athens wasn't a stop on Paul's tour. He was only there to escape the mob that had been following him from Thessalonica and then to Berea. Now, before he moved on, he was waiting for Timothy and Silas to catch up with him. But while Paul was in Athens, Luke says that he was deeply distressed by all the idols in the city. And that reaction speaks to Paul's heart. And it asks us, does the idolatry of this world grieve us or not? Does sin bother us, or have we come to see it as normal? Idolatry bothered Paul. And you might expect this man who was so zealous that he once persecuted Christians to start smashing idols, or at least to stand up in the market and be like, you guys stink. But Paul surprises us, perhaps, by taking us a different approach. He preaches in a synagogue, as he usually does, but then he also starts speaking in the agora, or marketplace. Now, it might seem strange to us to give a speech in aisle 8 of Walmart, but this was a time-honored custom. The Athenian agora, or marketplace, was a hub for shopping and banking, and as well as to perform religious rituals or even just to hang out. It's like the ancient mall. There were even some legal proceedings that happened in the agora, or in that area. One building, the Poikile Stoa, had rooms in the back for birthday parties. It's like a Chuck E. Cheese. But it was also where budding philosophers would come to announce their ideas and invite debate. I guess not like Chuck E. Cheese. This is probably where Paul went. And if you can imagine yourself in this agora area of ancient Greece, then imagine the things you're hearing all around you, okay? You can just close your eyes and picture it. There's somebody over there talking about interest rates. Somebody over there is trying to haggle over some new sandals. There are some philosophers over there doing their thing, right? And so it's just you're surrounded by all these different conversations. You're surrounded by the life of the city, justice, politics, philosophy, business. It's all happening in one location. And so instead of blasting the Athenians for their idolatry, Paul goes to the agora and begins talking in a way that invites the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers to debate with him. Now, I'm not going to get into the differences between the Stoics and the Epicureans. It's really kind of beside the point right now. But it is amazing to me that Paul could discuss the Hebrew Bible with any Jew. But he could also stand up and do philosophy in Athens with the philosophers. We know this because in his sermon later in this chapter, he mentions a passage from a Greek philosopher. And since this trip to Athens wasn't planned, Paul must have read Greek philosophy at some point in his life. There's a lot to be said for preparing broadly for whatever mission God has for you. I've heard Adventists say, you shouldn't read anything other than Adventist books, or, maybe at best, if they're really open-minded, just Christian books. But if Paul had done that, he wouldn't have been able to communicate with the people of Athens, and we would have been deprived of this sermon. So when we grow narrowly, we are only of narrow use to God. And of course, the anxiety people have is that if I read Greek philosophy, I might lose my faith. But why do we never think about that in the reverse? If I study Greek philosophy, I might be able to win people to Jesus that I otherwise couldn't win to Jesus. Why do we always look at the negative side of it? It is such a privileged mindset, and perhaps even selfish. What we need is a missionary mindset. A mindset belonging to a missionary is not focused on how can I be safe, but how can I reach other people? Now imagine if Jesus had said, if I go down there, I'm going to have to be around those sinners and they might tempt me to sin. It's much safer to stay in heaven. Some of us are more worried about being safe than about being useful to God. Paul here knew how to talk to zealous Jews and indifferent Greeks alike. And the more we enter this secular age we are all living in, the more we had better understand how to talk to the indifferent Greeks in our world. Paul was deeply bothered by seeing the Greeks' idols, but he didn't respond by grumbling and whining about how bad they were. He responded by getting out into the marketplace of ideas and proclaiming what he knew was true, but in a way that people could understand. On to Monday. So instead of blasting the Athenians for their idolatry, Paul goes to the Agora and begins talking in a way that invites the Stoics and the Epicurean philosophers to debate with him. Paul spoke about Jesus and the resurrection in the Agora, and it produced two different reactions. Some called him a pretentious babbler, and others said he seems to be proclaiming foreign gods. His audience didn't fully understand what he was saying, but they were intrigued enough to want to hear more. And this earned Paul a ticket out of the Agora and to the Areopagus. Now my guess is this is what Paul had ultimately wanted, because later he would be dead set on preaching the gospel to the Roman emperor, even if it cost him his liberty and his life. So why wouldn't Paul want to speak to the Areopagus, the leaders in Athens, at least the thought leaders? The Areopagus is basically a big rock, or maybe a small hill, but it's very unlikely Paul actually went there. Scholars think that over time the term Areopagus came to refer to the council of leaders, and it's unlikely they still climbed on top of a big rock in the open sun to discuss things. It's kind of how we Americans talk about the White House, which is both a building and a word that describes the institution. The president's advisors might be meeting in New York, and they might draft a statement and release it to the press, but it will say, the White House released the statement, even though it may have nothing to do with the building itself. Likewise, the Areopagus likely met somewhere in the Agora, and it's not just about this rock that we show pictures of sometimes. Now, when Paul shows up, they tell Paul that they heard he was proclaiming his strange new teaching and wanted to know what it was all about. This invites Luke's very judgmental comment in verse 21 when he says, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Dude, the Greeks didn't have political autonomy anymore since the Romans were in charge. So, what is there to do? Yet Luke's dig goes deeper. Luke sees through the proud Athenian thinkers as a clique that does nothing but sit around and talk. Now, there was some cultural rivalry between the Jews and the Greeks, but Luke could also be criticizing them because most of them ultimately didn't listen to Paul. So how could they listen to Paul and consider his ideas when all they did was talk? The gospel demanded action, demanded a decision. In any case, Paul took advantage of the fact that the Areopagus liked to discuss new ideas. Hey, y'all want to hear something new? Let's talk about resurrection. Tuesday, we catch up with the beginning of Paul's speech or sermon to the Areopagus. The absolute first thing you'll notice is that Paul praises them for being very religious. Now we know better. This whole thing started because Paul saw the idols and he was deeply distressed by this Greek form of religion. Here's Paul praising them for being very religious in the sense of being very devout believers. Why is that something he would praise them for? Now, this isn't to say Paul agrees with their devotion to these gods, and some scholars think Paul is kind of giving them a backhanded compliment because this word for very religious can also mean superstitious. But as Paul is attempting to persuade them to follow Jesus, I doubt he's trying to slyly insult them at the same time. I really wish more Christians understood how to strongly disapprove of sin, as Paul does, while finding things to appreciate about sinners. Paul sees the sin, but he looks for something good that he can compliment them on. Well, as the lesson says, Paul did not rush in as the self-proclaimed expert with all the answers for how people needed to change, like some of us. He came in humility and with genuine appreciation for how careful the Greeks were to worship the gods. And I say that the Greeks were careful because in this ancient pagan mindset, the gods were always warring. Today, we're skeptical of any god. Back then, the Greeks took for granted that there were gods that had not yet revealed themselves to them. And just because you didn't know who they were doesn't mean you could ignore them. Any god could bless you or curse you. So the Athenians found a way to honor any god they didn't know. They set up a place to worship the unknown god. Now, Paul picks up on this when he was doing his little tour of the city, and he realized that this was his opening. He would appear before them as an emissary of the unknown god. Now, wouldn't the Areopagus want to know the nature of this unknown God whom they're worshiping? Of course. Then they should listen to Paul. They couldn't afford to offend this God. Paul doesn't begin by denying the existence of all these false gods. He actually begins by noting that his God is one of the gods the Greeks already worshipped without knowing. Do you realize how many Christians today would be scandalized by this approach? We would accuse Paul of being a syncretist. And for those in the back who don't know, syncretism is really, I think, a missionary term to describe those who try to fuse their Christian beliefs with the beliefs of the target population. This is what many Protestants accuse the Catholics of weaving together Greek ideas of the human soul with biblical ideas of the human soul. Anyways, missionaries, of course, have to explain the gospel in a way their culture would understand, using the words, metaphors, imagery, whatever, of the people they're trying to reach. And so missionaries are often open to the charge of syncretism, usually by people who are safe back at home. But Paul is no syncretist. He is entering the Greek worldview, and he's saying, I see how careful you are to make sure to worship all of the gods, even the ones you don't know. I'm here to tell you about one of those gods you're worshiping whom you don't know. Is it scandalous to suggest that the Greeks were really worshiping the true God out of ignorance? Sure, in some circles. But Paul isn't saying that his God is only one of many. This is his approach to enter their world. If he began with, you see all these idols, losers? They're all trash gods, and I'm going to tell you about the real God. Well, that's likely as far as he would have gotten. Because he would have been steering his own worldview into their worldview. And instead, Paul enters their worldview where there are all these gods, and that's where he starts from. Let's move on to Wednesday and talk about what Paul says about his God. The first thing you're going to notice is how formal Paul is. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. But he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he gives everyone life and breath and everything else. During this entire sermon, Paul does not use the name of Jesus. The whole thing sounds very formal. He doesn't talk about God. He talks about the God. He quotes a Stoic philosopher, Adventist, to say that in God we live and move and have our being, which is a very wooden, very philosophical way to approach theology. These are not the words we are used to using when we talk about God. What's more, Paul is quoting that Stoic philosopher, Adventist, to make his point. He doesn't quote scriptures, but he uses these writings of Adventist in a way that they would respect in order to make his case. And yet what Paul is saying is very familiar, even if his sources and language are not familiar. He insists that this God doesn't need anything from humans, least of all, a temple. He is the creator who has given life to all and also directs the affairs of nations. Paul doesn't come out and say there's only one God and all your other gods are trash, but he describes this one God as if to provoke the thought in his listeners. If this one God does everything, why do I need these other gods? I don't think this sermon or speech would win Paul many friends among Christians today. I know when we Adventists begin an evangelistic series, we often start with Daniel 2. Why? Because it's the chapter we use to build some confidence in the Bible. And that's just fine. But what we're doing is showing up in Athens and trying to get them into our worldview so that we can talk to them. We got to get them onto our turf so we can have a conversation. Because once they accept the Bible, we have a basis of talking about all these other subjects. But Paul doesn't drag his listeners into his world. He enters their world. He uses their language. He appeals to their writings. He points to their idols. He knows what they believe, and he knows how to talk to them. And I wish more Christians knew how to talk to people who don't share their worldview. Paul isn't abandoning the gospel. He's just explaining it in a way they can understand. The more we enter this secular age, the more we are going to have to do this kind of stuff. The world looks more like Paul in Athens than Peter in Jerusalem, my friends. We need to learn what other people believe, and we need to learn to see the good in them, all without abandoning our own convictions. The lesson is absolutely right to point out that Paul demonstrates to them that he did his homework to learn what they believe. He isn't ignorant. When you take the time to learn what other people believe, you show that you care about what they value. And that's important. On Thursday, we wrap up our look at Paul's sermon for the Areopagus by looking at how it ends. After affirming that this unknown God is the creator and sustainer of all things, he moves in. Since we are God's offspring, as that Stoic poet Aratus had said, then why do we need gold and silver idols to depict this God? Are we not in the image of God? Personally, I find this to be a really creative, really interesting argument against idolatry. I mean, notice that he doesn't go to the Ten Commandments and say, see, God is against idolatry. Adultery, yes. Idolatry also. That wouldn't have gotten him anywhere. He looks for a logical inconsistency with idolatry, and in my opinion, he finds a good one. Paul declares that God had overlooked idolatry in the past, but now it is time to stop. But now is a key turn here, and it begs the question, why now? What changed? The answer, of course, is Jesus. Paul uses this but now or but God phrase often in his letters to show the sudden change that Jesus brought, to show the implications of the gospel. While he doesn't mention Jesus or the gospel explicitly in this sermon, anyone who's familiar with Paul knows that the but now is a reference to the fact that Jesus has come and how that this changes everything. The stakes are high because the judgment is coming. Not just the judgment, but the judge is coming. We can know this, Paul says, because God has raised the dead. Raised the judge from the dead. There, we got it. The Areopagus had no problem listening to talk about creation, judgment, even a discussion about idols. But as soon as Paul mentions the resurrection, the Areopagus wanted nothing to do with it. Once again, Paul's audience was divided. Some sneered at him, while others wanted to hear more. It is curious that they could listen to Paul speak against their idols, but they get tripped up by the resurrection. It's a good reminder of how Christianized we have become if we are not likewise shocked by the audacity of the idea of resurrection. And so Paul's sermon was cut short. The reaction of some of these in the Areopagus was no different than hostile Jews, despite the huge theological differences between Greeks and Jews. Jerusalem and Athens were both united against Jesus, but it is worth remembering that some did believe Paul and became Christians, even based on half of a sermon. Okay, Friday. This week's lesson was a look at Paul's sermon in Acts 17. Paul was angered by the idolatry in Athens, but he took the time to look around to understand their culture and viewpoint, and then played by their rules in speaking in the Agora, hoping to be heard and invited up to the Areopagus. And while he used their language and their philosophy, Paul didn't shy away from giving what was otherwise a very Christian view of God and humanity. I think there's a lot for us to study and apply in our own approach to reaching our world with the gospel. Now, first challenge on Thursday is to ask God for wisdom and how to witness to someone you know. The second challenge is to explore social media as a possible Areopagus that God is calling you to teach. I don't want to discourage you here about that, but you should be careful. The difference between tweeting on X and the Areopagus is that Paul was invited to the Areopagus, and he could look people in the eye there. He knew whom he was addressing. Those are important differences between the Areopagus and social media. Now, I would have my own challenge here. If you have some Mormon friends, study Mormonism. If you have some atheist or agnostic friends, study their viewpoint. Learn about the worldview of some of the people in your circle who are within your orbit so you can better talk to them down the road. Okay, that's going to do it for this week. Thanks so much for watching Sabbath School Boot Camp. I'll see you next week. Class dismissed.